Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everyone, to the next installment of the OurCrowd Teaching Tuesday webinar series. We hold these bi-monthly. These are events that we generally tackle topics that are of interest to our investors and the entrepreneurs on the OurCrowd platform. Tonight is a topic that's been months in the making. It's the relationship between Hong Kong and China and Israel. This is definitely a topic that's been written a lot in the press. I think we've assembled a great team to address this issue. Let me tell you a little bit first about who I am. I'm Zach Miller. I'm a partner here at OurCrowd. I run the investor community. It's my team that's working hard to produce this quality content that we hope is enjoyable to everybody. We did underestimate the interest in this event from people who actually reside in Asia. We thought this was almost a simple or an understandable message that they would already have access to. We got a lot of emails in the interim after we launched saying, hey, it's 2 a.m. in Hong Kong during the session. What about us? So I wanted to apologize, first of all. We underestimated the demand there. We will do our best in the future to have events that are easily accessible. It's getting harder for us as our platform grows, and we have active investors in over 30 countries to find events and find timing that's suitable to everybody. Regardless, we are recording this event tonight. We will send out the slides as well that are going to be used tonight, and we'll do our best. If you have questions of OurCrowd or myself in the future, feel free to send those to me. So we'll send out an email tomorrow for everybody who's registered with a link to the slides that are being used and to the recording. So without further ado, I just want to introduce Aurora Carlson. She joined us a few months ago and has quickly ramped up our presence in Asia. She's our Asia Investor Relations Manager here at OurCrowd. She brought in our first Asian investor to the platform, and she has a great perspective about where OurCrowd as a platform and investing in startups, the relationship between China, the Far East, and Israel. So I think we'll start with her. Following her, we're going to have Jonathan Steinberg, who is an Israel consultant of Invest Hong Kong. Invest Hong Kong advises and assists Israeli companies looking at Hong Kong as a springboard or base for their activities in mainland China and Asia at large. And we'll finish off the session tonight. It will be an hour. We won't go over with Victor Ofstein, who's the Chief Operating Officer of FreightOS. FreightOS was actually an OurCrowd investment that we made in 2012, and we invested again in 2013. It's a great technology platform. He'll be able to do a much better job than me introducing it. But stick around. I think you'll find value in each one of the three speakers. So without further ado, let me introduce Aurora.
Thank you, Zach. First of all, I want to thank you all for joining today's teach-in. And I want to welcome back anyone who was out celebrating Chinese New Year's for the past couple of weeks. First, I'll take a few moments to introduce myself. My name is Aurora Carlson. As Zach mentioned, I'm the Investor Relations Manager of Asia here at OurCrowd. My professional background thus far has ranged and danced across a spectrum of things related to China, including media, nonprofit, quasi-governmental, academia, and most recently venture capital in Israel. So I'm fluent in Mandarin. I'm located in our Jerusalem OurCrowd headquarters. Today I'm going to talk just mostly, hold on, this isn't working. Sorry, one moment, technical problem. Okay, so now you can see the screen. Today I'm joined by a few people who are mostly focused on Hong Kong. While we are also focused on Hong Kong today, I'm going to be speaking mostly about Greater China, which includes also mainland China. That being said, I think it's important to primer the audience with, in talking about this conversation, to mention how important Hong Kong still is to the mainland. It's still a very important waypoint for money going in and out of China. I think to date, about 30% of foreign direct investment going into China still has to go through Hong Kong. So it's a very important point, even though China is internationalizing very quickly. All right. So first, I want to look at kind of a more broad picture. Here we have China global OFDI trends, overseas foreign direct investment. So this graph kind of zooms outwards, looking at the world's emerging economies OFDI trends. We can see that it's only recently that Chinese OFDI has ballooned in comparison to the economies of India, Brazil, South Africa. These numbers, it's important to show that it's not trade flow, it's not manufacturing dumping, but it's actual portfolio investment or acquisitions made by the Chinese. So starting in the early 2000s, China invested only around $2 billion globally. By 2010, this reached about 60 billion. And then now, just passing 2014 was an important marker year. And that was the first time that Chinese outbound foreign direct investment exceeded inbound foreign direct investment. And in the next 5 years, it's predicted that Chinese overseas foreign direct investment will be anywhere in the range between 500 billion to about 2 trillion US dollars. So if we just think about those numbers from early 2000s, 2 billion to now climbing to 2 trillion, it's absolutely staggering. So for most Westerners, these sorts of statistics, these staggering numbers of OFDI are confusing. You might be sitting in the US thinking, yes, China is very active in foreign investments, but I don't feel it. And the reason is that most of Chinese overseas direct investments are still made in Asia. As you can see, 68% since 2013 were made in Asia. But this is changing just due to market saturation statistics and the increasingly sophisticated investing by Chinese firms. So there's four types or four categories of investment bodies. With all the hype, especially in the US, surrounding the Chinese government and the communist forces weaseling their way into foreign markets, the following fact might be a little bit surprising. Nearly 80% of total Chinese OFDI was actually generated by private firms, not state-owned, but private. So that's just to point out that China, and especially Chinese private firms, are really looking for tech. They're looking for new platforms. They're looking for brand recognition. Now we get to Israel. So in the past 10 years, trade between the two countries has increased 200%. But before we get into numbers about Israel, I want to backtrack a little bit. Here we have a beautiful picture of the sand dunes. Chinese and Israeli land masses were connected by trade a good 1,000 years ago along the Silk Trade route. Israel is in between the East and the West, both culturally and geographically. And I bring this point up not just to show a pretty picture with camels and sand, but more to show that, to inform that the psyches of both the Chinese and the Israeli people, the concept of civilization and civilizational links through history leading up to the present, this mentality is very strong in both cultures, which is a differentiating point from, say, the US. So after the Silk Trade era, there was a very long hibernation, and ties weren't reformalized until 1992. I think everyone listening to this webinar has probably been alive then, unless we have some very young listeners. And honestly, things on a trade level were pretty quiet and not too exciting until about 18 months to about 2 years ago. Just recently, to give you a sense of this, the Israeli chief scientist of Ministry of Economy said China this year is #1 in doing tech deals between our country, in doing China-Israel tech deals. 2 years ago, they stood at 0, to put lightly said and in a blunt Israeli manner. So in looking at trade volume, Israel and China started out 20 years ago at just $50 million. And by 2013, this reached $11 billion. More importantly, if we're looking at this graph, it's important to note that the first foreign direct investment made by China in Israel only happened in 2010. And so when that happened, until now, it's about 4.5 years ago. So now we look to see how Israel and China fit together. Israel has competitive advantages over a number of fields, including alternative energy, communications, medical devices, irrigation, and thank God, endowed with great human talent. In looking at bilateral China-Israel deals, about 50% is in agri-tech and software. So this thing that includes things like irrigation, seeds, greenhouses. This is one of my favorite stories, pointing to the Israel-China irrigation technology. So a few months ago, I'd say about 3 or 4 months ago, Israel formed a partnership with a city in Shandong province, the birthplace of Confucius, in a little place called Shouguang. Shouguang is a port village, and with the Israeli government, they created an Israeli water city. What is an Israeli water city? It's basically like an experimental zone to use Israeli water recycling, filtration, cleaning technologies into an entire living ecosystem. And this kind of a pilot program is very typical in China when the governments, both national and municipal governments, are looking to instill some sort of a larger program. They do an experimental social, economic, or environmental plan first, and then in hopes of applying it elsewhere. And I point to this to kind of zoom out a little bit and to show that the tech connection between Israel and China isn't just on a micro level of businesses to businesses, but also on a more macro level, government to government. So now, taking in account Israel's points of competitive advantage, competitive tech advantages, we looked at China's offerings. First, markets. In Chinese, there's a saying, 明知不问. It's a idiom that basically says, I don't have to go into this more. We all know China has huge markets, so I'm not going to say much more about this point. China is extremely, extremely cash rich. And not just the same wealth as it had 10 years ago. The wealth has changed increasingly in terms of the regulations associated with investing, especially foreign investing, as well as the sophistication of investors and personnel working with investment bodies, much more international minded. And finally, in our third circle here, we have demand, where you can see these people wearing masks because of the pollution. China, unfortunately, is plagued with extraordinary challenges related to air pollution, water pollution, as water shortages, as well as increased population. Even though the population control policies are still in place, the population growth is contributing to more demands on water, on agriculture. And so for this, China it's an immediate and desperate need for technologies to help the country survive in a very basic way. So the result of putting Israel and China together is almost unlikely, but a seamless fit between the interests of both economies. So for varying complex reasons, China has found it difficult to develop homegrown innovation to address its own problems, even though the number of engineers coming out of Chinese universities every year is far, far greater than any other country. In addition, Israel is a little bit less complicated to deal with politically for China, comparing it to the U.S. All right. So in 2003, I wrote an article in the Israel Journal of Foreign Affairs exploring Chinese OFDI into Israel. And what I found, it was very difficult for me to find even a few good examples of what was going on, big deals. But anyway, then we get to 2014, and there was visits, deals, investments, media coverage, and it just kind of all appeared and happened all at once. And now we see huge names just in 2014 coming, and we have Alibaba, Fosun, Baidu, Ping An, Chihu 360, Founder Group, and they're investing in very real Israeli startups. We have things like on the far left, Visual Lead, which is just invested in by Alibaba. We have nanotechnology companies. We have on the far right, we have a biodegradable packaging made out of orange peels. These are all companies that Chinese companies just invested in the past year. And so now we get to OurCrowd in China. OurCrowd has gained a lot of traction here. Our investor base actually comes from all of the major cities in China. And when I say major, it doesn't include some of the cities listed on this page, like Urumqi and Kashga. It's more on the East Coast that we have our investor base. And most of our investors are high net worth or ultra high net worth individuals. I'd say some of our investors have special affinity to Israel, but most are just looking seeking high profit and to be at the front of the investment trends of our age. This is Jonathan Medved, our CEO. We are very often in China, either in any given month, one or some of our team members will be somewhere in mainland China or Hong Kong. And then crowdfunding in China. Crowdfunding already exists in China in a substantial way, all different types of crowdfunding. The most important thing I want to say about this in this context is that regulations are recently being eased, and there's been special task forces within the Chinese Securities Bureau assigned to supporting specifically equity crowdfunding, of which OurCrowd is the largest equity crowdfunding platform in the world. So with that, thank you very much. And if you have any more questions regarding OurCrowd's activity in the Greater China region, I would be happy to field any questions.
Great. So thank you for a great presentation, Aurora. I know you were running out of time near the end and kind of hurried through the last part. That was very interesting. As we set up the transition to our next presenter, I want to introduce Jonathan Steinberg. He's a consultant based here in Israel for an organization called Invest Hong Kong. Invest Hong Kong advises and assists Israeli companies looking at Hong Kong as a springboard base for their activities in mainland China and Asia at large. Jonathan, we're turning controls over to you to take your end of the presentation. Just so everybody knows, there is a way to ask questions. We'll hopefully address all the questions at the end of the presentation. There should be a question button or section in your GoToWebinar control panel. Use that to submit the questions, and we'll do our best to answer them at the end if we have sufficient time. So, Jonathan, I'd like to turn it over to you to start your side of the presentation.
Thanks, Zach, and thanks for the folks at OurCrowd for organizing this interesting webinar. Thank you all for joining. What I'd like to do is I'll just briefly introduce myself and familiarize you a little bit with the Hong Kong ecosystem. Aurora touched upon some great points that are leading into my presentation, so I think that was also a great start. So my name is Jonathan Steinberg. I'm in charge of business development in a Jerusalem-based consulting firm called the EDI, and for the past 2.5 years have been working with Invest Hong Kong. As Zach mentioned, Invest Hong Kong is a government organization which assists companies, my role specifically in Israel, but we have offices in 28 countries, over 35 cities, and we assist companies that are expanding in Asia and considering establishing a presence in Hong Kong. Well, on a webinar, it's harder to ask for a show of hands to see who's familiar and who's been to Hong Kong, but just to give you a little bit of an understanding of where we are geographically. So Hong Kong is in southern China, right across the street, if you will, from places like Shenzhen. And within 5 hours flight, you can cover half of the world's population. So it's strategically located in the heart of Asia, but right across from China. When speaking in Hong Kong, you'll often hear people refer to the term the Pearl River Delta, which is an economic zone or economic hub stretching from Guangzhou down to Hong Kong, which also includes Macau. Now, this economic zone is bigger than many economies that we're familiar with, and just looking population-wise, it's also a market on its own with over 55 million people, bigger than Canada, and a quite substantial GDP. Now, as far as infrastructure, this is also the manufacturing hub of China. Now, when I say manufacturing, we're referring more to electronics and high-tech manufacturing. Companies like Foxconn, manufacturers for Apple and others, are located in this part of China. And as infrastructure-wise, it's very easy to travel from one place to the other. Right now, they're also building that infrastructure or advancing the infrastructure even further, with trains being able to get to Shenzhen in a couple of years within 15 minutes, into Guangzhou within 45 minutes. So a very important economic zone, which is part of southern China. Now, often people ask, or people don't understand the difference between Hong Kong and China. Hong Kong is, after the handover from the British, the handover back to China, Hong Kong is de facto part of China, but is defined as Hong Kong SAR, Special Administrative Region. Under the special criteria, or the one country, two systems definition, Hong Kong has its own judiciary, its own rule of law, its own immigration policy, its own monetary policy. So in Hong Kong, we would use the Hong Kong dollar. Regulation, IP regulation, which is also very important when dealing with technology or investment aspects, is completely different. And something that's very important to keep in mind when interacting either with Chinese companies or when interacting with the Chinese market. Another advantage that Hong Kong has to offer is a very low and simple tax system, definitely compared to mainland China, but people often like to compare Hong Kong with Singapore as well. Especially Israeli companies going east would often look at either Hong Kong or Singapore to establish their regional headquarters. If you're going to China, or you see China as a substantial part of your Asia business, Hong Kong does offer some advantages. The corporate tax is capped at 16.5%. The personal income tax is capped at 15%, a little bit more attractive than what we pay here in Israel. I'm sure you'll agree on that. And a few other sort of perks and advantages when investing into Hong Kong is that there's no VAT, no capital gains tax, no withholding tax, and one of my favorites, in 2008, since 2008, there's no tax on wine. So Hong Kong is also a great place to buy wine. Infrastructure-wise, Hong Kong is very well connected to internet, especially compared to when looking at mainland China. Those of you who have traveled through China often had issues with Gmail or Facebook or other sites, so Hong Kong has a free and very robust internet infrastructure, which is very important for I would say for all of us these days. Now, human capital, Hong Kong has some of the best universities in Asia. It's very easy to find excellent people for sales, business development, people who are very well familiar with the Chinese or Asian mentality and the way of conducting business. The caveat that I would add here, for especially technological companies looking to hire tech talent, developers, programmers in Hong Kong, that's something that we're still not seeing enough of. So that is a challenge. But as far as scaling up your business out of Hong Kong, I think you'll find great people to grow your business with. Now, Aurora spoke a little bit about timing, and I think that we're in sort of the golden era of the Israel-Asia or Israel-China relationship. You know, as Aurora mentioned, a few years ago we saw very little activity, but now we're seeing that also the wealth has shifted and has shifted east. Hong Kong, Asia at large, has a very high concentration of high net worth individuals. High net worth individuals are spending a lot of money, not only in purchasing and consuming, but also in making investments. Hong Kong attracts over 54 million visitors. Many of those come in from mainland China. It could be day travelers coming for shopping, or companies or individuals coming in for business. What's interesting to note here, especially in the consumer products space, we're seeing a lot of companies, including a couple of Israeli companies like Sabon and Premier, that established operations in Hong Kong to also create some brand awareness before expanding into mainland China. As you can see from the breakdown of the slide, out of the 54 million visitors, many come in from China, and that's where they get acquainted with some of the international brands. Unfortunately, we don't have very many of these high-end Israeli fashion retailers, but just to give you a sense, anybody who's been to Hong Kong sees quite a few Salvatore Ferragamos, Burberrys, and other brands that I wasn't familiar with before traveling there. But my wife is quite happy every time I come back with some gifts. Now, this is also something that Aurora mentioned, and it's a very interesting graph when looking at the numbers. Many mainland Chinese companies, before going global, they first establish a presence in Hong Kong. They transfer funds, establish a presence, and from there, they handle their interactions with either global companies that are coming to Hong Kong, or from their Hong Kong operation, they would then invest outwards. So I think that's also a very interesting thing, a very interesting trend to note, and we're seeing more and more of that. Invest Hong Kong just opened its 5th office in mainland China, and of the companies that we assist on an annual basis, I would say that about 50% of the companies overall are mainland Chinese companies that are expanding into Hong Kong. So that really is a crossroads and a great meeting point for you to meet and sign deals with your Chinese counterparts. What we're also seeing is a lot of large companies, I'm sure you're familiar with a few of the names here, that are establishing their regional or global headquarters in Hong Kong for various reasons. Obviously, taxes is one, but also the ability to, as Aurora mentioned, the issue of infrastructure. And as China is becoming a more important market for many of these companies, they have decided to establish their headquarters in Hong Kong and manage activities from there. One company that moved recently, and I thought was very interesting, was Nissan Infiniti, that uprooted their global headquarters from Tokyo and moved to Hong Kong. GE manages everything except for the US. The US has its own headquarters, still based in the States, but outside of the US, everything under GE is managed out of Hong Kong. So it's something interesting to note. Now, it's not only the big companies that are coming, we're also seeing a lot of small companies, some startups. Made in Sense here is an Israeli startup into wearable devices that's also in Hong Kong. And we're seeing from e-commerce to medical devices, we're seeing a lot of companies that are starting up in Hong Kong. Some of the Israeli companies that we're seeing recently, some of the bigger ones, of course, are Verint and Nice, Radwin, Tsim, which has been there for many years. A couple of interesting recent moves to Hong Kong is a company by the name of Dr. Jean. Dr. Jean is a company based on research from the Weizmann Institute, very similar to 23andMe, if you're familiar with the American company that does DNA testing as a service. So they've focused their research on Han-based DNA, which is Chinese or Greater China DNA sequences, and they're now offering their services. Leverate, which is interesting, fintech companies, and some of the others as well. Now, for many years, the Hong Kong, at least for companies expanding to Hong Kong, they were attracting really the bigger or mid-size companies that were more cash-rich, if you will, who can spend the money and come and expand to Hong Kong. But as part of the global trend of trying to attract innovative, scalable startups, a couple years ago, we launched a new program called the Start Me Up HK program, which is a competition for startups from around the world. You may recognize the name here, FreightOS, and next presenter, Victor, might be able to elaborate a little bit about that. But the second person from the right on the holding the trophy over there is Zvi Schreiber from FreightOS. They won the competition in 2014. But why entrepreneurs come to Hong Kong for various reasons. Some we mentioned are the connectivity, the profit center, which really is the simple, the tax regime, law, especially when dealing with, again, technology and IP issues. You really want to be in a place where you know that your IP is protected, and you have the chance of suing and actually winning. So it is really something that is important. Efficiency, something that Victor might be able to, or I'd be happy also to address in the Q&A. Establishing a business in Hong Kong is very, very efficient. I established a business here in Israel, and I've assisted companies establishing businesses in Hong Kong. The system is very transparent, very easy. It's all in English. And saying that it takes $1 Hong Kong and 1 hour really means that it is a very, very simple process. I wouldn't hold my breath and wait for 1 hour, but within a week or two, you can be up and running with your business and registered corporation in Hong Kong. As I mentioned, as far as the startup ecosystem, we are seeing a lot of changes and a lot of interesting trends within the Hong Kong ecosystem. We're seeing co-working spaces and incubators and a lot of startups that are popping up. I mentioned the issue of finding technological co-founders or technological employees. That is still a challenge, but we're seeing people coming from abroad and using Hong Kong to grow their business. As far as support organizations, there are many. I'd be happy to put you in touch with any of the one registered here. An interesting accelerator that just started is an accelerator established by AIA, which is a 3-month program for e-health startups that are looking at Asia. So we're seeing a lot of international players that are coming into Hong Kong and establishing those types of accelerators and incubators as well. Just a little bit about the ecosystem. We have a lot of government incubators as well. Some provide cash funding, others provide other incentives. Cyberport is one that's listed here. Focuses more on software, apps, and other technologies. There's another incubator established by the Hong Kong Science Technology Parks, focusing more on wearable devices, on medical technologies, and others. So it's an interesting program where entrepreneurs could come and get accepted to a government-funded incubator. Now, as far as VC or investments in Hong Kong startups, we are seeing more and more investments, and I think Aurora made a very good point of showing both the high net worth individuals that are investing in platforms like OurCrowd, but also making direct investments in the companies. We're seeing investments both by corporates, some were mentioned before, Ping An, Baidu, and others, but also some direct investments. What's interesting when approaching Asian investors is that even with the angel investors, we're still seeing that many of them are still very, very prudent, very cautious. So even when you're dealing with relatively small sums of money, some look at deals as if they were making private equity investments. But it's interesting. The investors are becoming more and more savvy, and they are looking for good deals both locally in Hong Kong or in China, but also abroad. So I think that there are definitely more and more opportunities. It's not just Li Ka-shing and Horizons Ventures. There are many other both private and corporate investors that are investing in Israel. What can companies really use Hong Kong for? Hong Kong is not for everybody or for every business. You have to really leverage Hong Kong to serve the right functions for your business. So a great resource that Hong Kong can serve as a test market, a proof of concept market for companies like smart city solutions or fintech, where Hong Kong has a very dense infrastructure, where companies could come, do a few beta sites, proof of concept, and then bring in their clients from other Chinese cities to come and potentially become paying customers, to scale your business, to establish a Hong Kong entity, and from there manage other subsidiaries in mainland China. But Hong Kong isn't only about work. This, even though it looks like an island in Thailand, is a part of Hong Kong that is less known. So if you are there, it's important to also enjoy a little bit of what Hong Kong has to offer. It's not all business and technology. A little bit about what we do. We provide, of course, all of our services as a government organization are free and confidential. But we provide guidance in how companies should establish their business, structure their business. We provide PR and marketing support and introductions to either service providers or potential partners in Hong Kong. If anybody would like to get in touch with me, I'd be happy to get on a call or a meeting, or of course take questions at the end of this session. Again, just want to thank everybody at OurCrowd for organizing this interesting event, and looking forward to being in touch.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. We're now going to transition controls over to Victor Ofstein. You mentioned him in your talk. Victor is the Chief Operating Officer of FreightOS, which actually won the Startup HK competition. So that's there is kind of a commonality, a common thread between the three presentations you've heard tonight. OurCrowd, as an equity crowdfunding platform and investment platform, it first invested in FreightOS in November 2012, and then again in August 2013. FreightOS has set up their operations in Hong Kong, and I think Victor has a very unique perspective to lend to the conversation tonight. So, Victor, take it away.
Okay, thanks so much, Zach, and thanks to everyone for giving us the time. I'm going to talk briefly today about FreightOS and about our vision, as well as our relationship to the Far East in general and to Hong Kong and China in particular. FreightOS, as was mentioned by Jonathan just before, we made the strategic decision when we started to headquarter our company in Hong Kong, even though the management sits in Israel. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about why we did that during the presentation. At this point in time, and I didn't know that Jonathan was going to mention this, but we are the proud recipients of the Invest Hong Kong Award in 2014, and we're already starting to really feel the benefits of the important work that Jonathan and his organization are doing to help companies like ours make inroads into the market in Hong Kong and China, and also in the Far East. So let me talk a little bit about FreightOS and who we are. In fact, I also didn't know that Aurora was going to mention the silk trade, the silk route, but I'm going to mention it as well because it's quite an important context to what FreightOS is all about. The silk route refers obviously to a network of ancient trade routes that connected Asia and Europe and Africa, and extended more than 6,500 kilometers. The Silk Route was used mainly to transport Chinese silk to Europe through Central Asia, really from the 2nd century BC. However, back then, Rome, which is where most of the silk and the commodities ended up, in Rome, only the aristocrats could actually afford to buy the silk. So fast forward to 2015, and everything that you use, eat, and wear has been shipped by land, air, and ocean, sometimes through multiple legs and complex routes, by the time it ends up as a product or a good. And the freight industry is unfathomably large. 602 million containers are shipped every year, and 200 billion ton kilometers are shipped by air. If you look at how world trade has grown, $18.7 trillion worth of goods crossed borders. And that's grown about 10 times since the year that I was born. Now, when FreightOS flies out to our Hong Kong headquarters, we compare prices for the air tickets on Expedia or Kayak, and we normally buy the best result. But that's not how it works for freight. The freight industry has not kept up with the information age, And to prove that, just try Googling for the price of a freight shipment. You'll get nothing. So as an importer or an exporter, when you phone a freight provider, it takes days to get a price quote. Honestly. We actually tried to get about 80 freight quotes from 15 different forwarders, and the average quote took over 3 days, and about 43% of the forwarders never even got back to us. It's almost like someone forgot about the freight industry in the last century. So Netflix, Twitter, Amazon, but not in freight. Anyone who's selling any product or providing any service in the year 2015 knows that customers, no matter who they are, have never been more empowered with the ability to instantly compare, choose, and book. And they're also becoming more and more impatient. As a freight provider, while you are taking your time to quote, you can bet that your customers are shopping around. In addition, 15 years ago, as a manufacturer, you may have been tied to one factory. It was simply too difficult to find alternatives. Now, Alibaba has led the trend of flexible sourcing. Nowadays, you can source the right provider at the right time, and the experience of switching is fairly easy. But none of this has happened in the freight industry. And in the end, when freight prices aren't optimized, every consumer ends up paying more. So I'm just going to take a moment to compare the lack of modernization in the freight industry to how air travel has modernized. Okay, as you can see on the slide, you've got the cross-section of a jet, a passenger jet, and on the upper deck of the airplane, travel agents have been able to book electronically as early as the late 60s and 1970s. And now travelers can compare and book online within seconds. But on the lower deck, however, even in the year 2015, there's no direct way of booking space for your cargo. So FreightOS is all about changing this, optimizing the way that freight is bought and sold. We're founded and led by Tzvi Schreiber, who's a serial Israeli software entrepreneur who successfully sold multiple companies, including a complex software startup acquired by IBM. Now, on the logistics side, he CEO'd an electronics company called Litec that was eventually acquired by GE, and Litec had an office in Wanchai and manufacturing in Shenzhen, and lots of experience with international shipping. It was this experience as freighting electronic components around the world that gave birth to the FreightOS vision of changing the way that freight is bought and sold. So how does it work? We've got patent-pending algorithms that analyze millions of possible freight routes, all in a few seconds, to find the very best price and the very best time to get anything to anywhere. It runs on tablets, it runs in the cloud, and we're delivering this to the international shipping industry. By and large, they've never seen anything like it. And we're delivering. So on the supply side, for 3 years now, we've partnered with multi-billion-dollar freight forwarders, such as CEVA Logistics, and another one that we've actually just started working with called Hellman, whose logo is not there yet. And then on the supply side, on the demand side, we're working with huge customers of freight, like M&S and Cisco Foods. Usage of FreightOS to automate freight quotes has grown 6 times since our product launch at the end of 2013. In addition to that, we're using big data techniques to really shine a light on the freight industry. As you can see, FreightOS also works in many languages and currencies. Now, on the investment side, we're very proud to mention that OurCrowd were early backers, and to date, FreightOS has attracted over $9 million of investment. So one of our, Robert Mylod, was CFO of Priceline, and he helped build Priceline into a $60 billion US valuation. But now we're building Priceline for freight. So just to summarize, the time has come to modernize international freight. Companies like Alibaba are making supply chains far more dynamic. Product cycles are shorter, and shipping costs need to catch up. They need to be instant and transparent. So the relationship between FreightOS and the Far East is critical. Of course, the vast majority of the world's freight moves from east to west. Okay, $714 billion worth of goods to Europe and the US were imported from Asia in 2013, and this continues to rise. This graphic shows the world's largest seaports. And as you can see, they're color-coded. Shanghai, Singapore, Shenzhen, and Hong Kong are way ahead of the pack as the busiest ports in the world. And Hong Kong has got the world's #1 cargo airport. So why Hong Kong and China? Welcome to the world capital of international shipping and the entire trade ecosystem that that accolade brings. So as I mentioned, FreightOS is incorporated in Hong Kong, and this has so far proven to be a great move for us. We feel we've only reached the tip of the iceberg to date as we constantly seek customers and partners. And just a word here now, probably about 30% of our customers are Far Eastern customers. We have customers certainly in Singapore, Hong Kong, and China, and we're starting to move out now into new territories, new for us at least, like Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and of course, being based for us, being based in Hong Kong is critical to that. So we're constantly seeking customers and partners in the Far East that share the vision of bringing the freight industry online. So just thanks everyone for your time. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you for a great presentation, Victor, and thank you, Jonathan, also for a great presentation. We have time for just a couple questions that have come through. Let's start with you, Victor, since you just finished your presentation. You mentioned that the match with Hong Kong and setting up there, you've only begun to kind of capitalize on locating there. Were there any unforeseen things that having known what you know now, maybe you would have done differently in terms of making that move?
That's a good question. Let me think about that carefully. In retrospect is always a great thing. I think that firstly, we headquartered in Hong Kong right from the start, which for us was a great move. It meant that certainly when we were approaching our first customers in the Far East, it gave us a big strategic advantage. We have actually a really good, unique blend of people with whom we're working in Hong Kong and China. And when I say a blend of both locals, so we work with agents as well as employees in Hong Kong and China, as well as relocated. So we have actually just started working with someone that relocated and has been based in Taiwan for the last 5 years. And for us, that blend has been very, very important, simply because you cannot ignore the power of local cultural presence. And even though Hong Kong is incredibly international, when we move a little further afield into China, then having local presence and local representation has been critical. I'm not saying that that's a lesson learned. We were doing that from fairly early on. It's certainly I've realized the importance of doing that.
Understood. Just a follow-up question. We had a couple investors, a couple participants on the call tonight asking if you'll make the FreightOS presentation you made tonight available afterwards. Is that cool with you?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Great. Next question is going to be for Jonathan. So you help Israeli companies kind of use Hong Kong as a springboard into Asia. Are there particular what is the best way? I'm trying to understand the question here. The best way for Israeli companies to do that? Can they do it with kind of sending an executive back and forth, or do they really need to kind of set up a presence on the ground to really take advantage of what Hong Kong has to offer?
Okay, so I think it depends on the industry and the nature of the business. Initially they may have somebody traveling back and forth, at some point, and as Victor mentioned, it is very important to have the local presence and build the relationship with your customers. So I would say that in the short term, it's good to travel back and forth, not to rush into establishing a presence or making investments that the company is ready for. But in the medium and long term, it is very important to have a presence on the ground.
Makes total sense. With that, I'd like to wrap it up. I'd like to thank Aurora, Jonathan, and Victor for joining us this evening. Thank you guys. Everybody presented great, and we'll do our best to send out the recording of this presentation tomorrow. Feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. We do these types of events twice a month. If you're interested in continuing to participate in these educational opportunities, there were a few attendees who actually had suggestions for future events. We might ask the three of you guys to come back on. There's some more specific questions surrounding maybe intellectual property, some legal representation on the ground. I think that we could have some follow-up events as well that I think would be very interesting. With that, I'm Zach Miller here at OurCrowd. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us, and have a good evening or day wherever you are in the world. All the best.